January 11th, 1944. High above central Germany, the air is so cold it feels brittle, like glass about to crack. Below, a river of American bombers moves in tight formation, metal wings flashing in thin sunlight. Condensation streams from engines and freezes into long white scars across the sky. Every man inside those aircraft knows the mathematics of daylight war. Altitude buys time, formation buys chance, and chance can vanish in seconds. Then the first dark shapes rise. German fighters climb hard from the haze, timing their approach to hit where escorts are weakest. Flak blooms in heavy black puffs, hanging in the air like ink. On the bomber line, gunners twist in their turrets, tracking shadows that grow larger with every heartbeat. Off the formation's edge, a single P-51 Mustang holds position, close enough to be seen from the bomber's windows. And when the moment comes that he loses the protection of his own group, he does not turn away. He stays, because everything that follows will be decided by whether long-range escort is finally enough. By the winter of 1943, the air war over Europe had reached a breaking point. The United States Army Air Forces believed in daylight precision bombing. It was a doctrine built on industrial logic and moral clarity. Strike factories, rail yards, oil plants, targets that fed Germany's ability to wage war. Bomb by day. Let accuracy replace terror. Let industry, not civilians, be the battlefield. But Doctrine did not fly alone. From the first deep penetrations into occupied Europe, American bomber crews learned a hard truth. The further they flew, the more exposed they became. German radar stations tracked formations long before they crossed the coast. Fighters waited on the ground, engines warm, fuel measured. They climbed only when the bombers were committed, when turning back would mean mission failure. In 1942 and early 1943, escort fighters simply could not go far enough. P-47s and P-38s performed well over France and the Low Countries, but their fuel limits forced them to turn back before reaching Germany's industrial heartland. The Luftwaffe understood this boundary intimately. They called it the escort gap. Inside that gap, the bombers were alone. October 1943 made the cost undeniable. The Schweinfurt-Regensburg missions shredded optimism. Dozens of B-17s fell in a single day. Entire crews vanished over Germany. The 8th Air Force lost aircraft faster than factories could replace them, and morale sank with every empty bunk in English airfields. Yet the bombing did not stop. Instead, American planners doubled down. If daylight bombing was to continue, the escort problem had to be solved, not partially, not occasionally, but decisively. Fighters would have to stay with the bombers all the way to the target and back. They would have to fight, not just defend, and they would have to do it at altitude, over enemy territory, again and again. The solution had been forming quietly in training fields and design offices long before it proved itself in combat. The North American P-51 Mustang was not originally built as a long-range escort. Its early versions flew reconnaissance and ground attack missions. But when paired with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, something changed. At high altitude, the aircraft was fast, stable, and, most critically, efficient with fuel. With external drop tanks, the Mustang could do what no American fighter had reliably done before: stay. By late 1943, Mustangs were arriving in England in growing numbers. Pilots trained for long missions, hours at altitude, escort discipline measured not in minutes but in patience. They learned that escorting bombers was not about chasing kills. It was about presence, being visible, being close, being stubbornly in the way. The Luftwaffe noticed the difference almost immediately. German fighter pilots had grown used to attacking bombers in predictable windows. They exploited escort turnback times, masked for frontal assaults, then disengaged to climb and repeat. But as 1943 turned into 1944, those windows began to close. Fighters that should have been alone over Germany found American escorts still there, low on fuel, sometimes outnumbered, but refusing to leave. This shift began to change the character of the air war. Instead of brief, violent encounters, escorts now forced prolonged combat. German pilots burned fuel earlier, took more risks, and faced fighters that could match them in speed and altitude. The cost of interception began to rise, not catastrophically yet, but enough to be felt. By January 1944, the air war was no longer just about bombers reaching targets. It was about whether Germany could still contest its own skies. And that question would be pressed harder than ever during the deep penetration missions of early 1944, missions designed not just to destroy factories, but to force the Luftwaffe into the air and break it there. One of those missions would fly on January 11th, and one escort pilot would discover, in that thin winter sky, exactly how narrow the margin had become. In England, the war had a rhythm that felt almost industrial. Cold mornings on muddy airfields, engines coughing to life in the dark, crews walking toward aircraft with their collars up, breath turning to fog. Briefings delivered under harsh lights, routes drawn in grease pencil, flak belts circled, expected fighter reaction marked with blunt confidence. By early 1944, the 8th Air Force was flying with a new purpose, not just to hit targets, but to force a decision. American planners understood something that didn't appear on the mission maps. Germany could replace factories faster than it could replace experienced fighter pilots. Every time the bombers went deep, the Luftwaffe had to respond. And every time it responded, it spent fuel, aircraft, and men who could not be trained quickly enough to match the losses. So the logic hardened. Keep going. Go deeper. Make the enemy come up and fight. That was the strategic pressure behind the winter operations. An air campaign aimed at cracking the German fighter force in the air, while the bombers cracked German production on the ground. But pressure worked both ways. Germany's defenses were layered and disciplined. Radar early warning, ground controllers steering fighter groups toward incoming formations, anti-aircraft guns concentrated around key industrial zones, and fighter tactics refined over years of bitter experience. Frontal attacks that minimized exposure to bomber guns, coordinated passes that forced gunners to split their fire, and disciplined disengagement to climb and strike again. For the bomber crews, it was not one battle. It was a sequence of battles, a running fight that began far from the target and didn't end until the North Sea was behind them again. And January 1944 meant those battles happened in winter air. At altitude, the cold could kill. Oxygen systems froze. Hands went numb. Oil thickened. Visibility turned treacherous. Sun glare, haze, thin cloud layers that could hide an approaching fighter until the last moment. The men in the bombers sat inside aluminum cylinders where frost formed on the walls, listening to intercom chatter and the metallic clatter of their own aircraft. Fighter pilots lived in a different kind of isolation. Long missions meant long silence. The steady pressure of the mask on the face, the faint taste of rubber and oxygen. Hours of staring into a pale sky, scanning for movement that might be a wingtip, a glint, a lie created by sunlight. Escort work demanded restraint, staying with aircraft that were slower, heavier, and locked to a route they could not abandon. And yet, the escort was everything. A fighter that stayed close could force a German pilot to hesitate, break an attack angle, or release too early. A fighter that left, even briefly, could create a gap that would be exploited within minutes. The Luftwaffe had been living off those gaps. Now it faced a new reality: escorts that didn't vanish at the edge of Germany. That shift was not abstract. It changed what German pilots saw through their canopies. It changed how they calculated risk. It changed whether they could press an attack or had to peel away, chased by aircraft that could follow them down and still climb back up. By January 11th, the Americans were ready to test the system at full stretch. The mission would go deep toward a key aircraft production area. That mattered not only because of what could be destroyed on the ground, but because it was the kind of target that demanded a Luftwaffe response. Aircraft plants were not just factories. They were the bloodstream of German air defense. If those facilities were threatened, fighters would rise, because they had to. On that day, escort groups climbed with the bombers and took their positions along the formation. High cover, close escort, weaving elements scanning above and behind. Amongst them flew Colonel James H. Howard, a group commander tasked with doing what the new escort doctrine demanded: keep the bombers protected even when the fight turned ugly, even when it became personal. And over Germany, it always became personal. Because once the enemy appeared, every decision compressed into seconds. Stay with the bombers or chase the threat. Hold altitude or dive to save a crew. Protect the formation as a whole or gamble everything to break a single attack. January 11th would force those choices into the open. Not in a clean, planned way, but in the chaotic, unforgiving way war always prefers. And as the bomber stream pushed onward into winter sky, the escorts began to spot the first climbing specks. Small at first, then unmistakable, until the air itself seemed to tighten with incoming danger. Up there, war often begins without sound. Inside the Mustang's cockpit, there is no roar the way people imagine it from the ground. Only the steady vibration through the seat, the pressure of the oxygen mask, the hiss of regulated air. A pilot's world shrinks to instruments, canopy glass, and the pale emptiness beyond. The sky looks clean, almost peaceful, until it suddenly isn't. For escort pilots, the hardest part is not the fight, it's the waiting. Hours of scanning, eyes drying, neck aching from constant movement, the mind balancing two opposing instincts, the urge to hunt and the discipline to stay. Long-range escort missions demanded endurance as much as courage. Fuel had to be managed with near-obsessive care. Ammunition was finite, and every minute spent chasing a decoy could be the minute a bomber formation was left exposed. Then the fighters appear, dark marks against a bright sky, and everything changes at once. The body reacts before the thoughts catch up. Hands tighten on the stick. The mouth goes dry beneath the mask. The heart rate spikes, not from panic, but from the body's recognition that the next few minutes might decide whether dozens of men live or die. And yet the most human moment is often the smallest. A single pilot realizing he is farther from help than he expected. On January 11, 1944, that realization came for James H. Howard when contact and formation discipline began to fracture under pressure. In a sky filled with aircraft, it is possible to become alone in seconds, through cloud, glare, distance, or a single wrong turn. And when you're alone at that altitude, you don't just feel isolated, you feel the weight of everyone beneath you. Because the bombers can't sprint, they can't scatter. They can only hold their line and hope the escorts are still there. And if they look out and see only one Mustang, they don't see a plane. They see a promise. That promise would be tested again and again in the minutes ahead. From above, bomber formations looked like geometry. Boxes stacked and interlocked, each aircraft covering the next with defensive fire. It was a system built on mutual protection. But it had limits. German fighter tactics were designed to find those limits and punish them. The most dangerous attacks were often frontal. Coming head-on, fighters reduced the time bomber gunners had to track and fire. A high-speed pass could be over before defensive guns could properly lead the target. Then, the attacker could roll away, climb, and come again, using altitude like a bank account. Escort fighters disrupted this cycle. Even one fighter in the right place could force German pilots to break off an approach early, spoil their aim, or shift from the bomber formation to a defensive fight of their own. That mattered because bomber crews lived on narrow margins. Slight changes in angle and timing could mean the difference between a burst hitting a cockpit or tearing harmlessly through empty sky. Escort doctrine was evolving fast by early 1944. Do not simply hover near the bombers, but engage threats before they reached firing range. It was a dangerous balance. Push too far, and you left a gap. Stay too close, and you reacted too late. The best escort leaders learned to read the incoming attack, place their fighters between the threat and the bombers, and strike at the moment when the attacker was committed, when it could not easily evade. Howard's later Medal of Honor action is remembered because it was not a clean, single engagement. It was a sustained series of decisions made under pressure, choosing when to pursue, when to return, and when to position himself as a shield even when he had no wingman beside him. That kind of fighting doesn't look glamorous. It looks repetitive. It looks exhausting. It looks like a pilot throwing his aircraft into the path of danger again and again because the alternative is letting the danger reach the bombers unchecked. And in January 1944, a single mistake could cascade. One bomber breaks formation, becomes isolated, and is quickly swarmed. Another crew sees it and tightens up, risking collision. A fighter escort dives to help, burns fuel, loses altitude, and can't climb back in time for the next wave. The sky was not one battle. It was a chain reaction of problems. One escort fighter, staying close and choosing the right moments to engage, could interrupt that chain reaction. That is why the moment Howard found himself alone did not automatically mean the bombers were doomed, but it meant the fight would be personal. A group commander in the air was not just a pilot with a higher rank. He was a moving decision point. His job was to keep his unit coherent in a situation designed to shatter coherence, enemy attacks, weather, fuel constraints, and the simple physics of speed and distance. Under combat conditions, formations stretched. Radio calls overlapped. Visibility shifted. Pilots could lose sight of their own flight in a blink. Leadership in that environment wasn't speeches or slogans. It was judgment. Howard had been given the same mission as every escort leader: protect the bombers. But combat has a way of turning orders into questions. What matters more, staying with your assigned position or adapting when the enemy forces the fight into a new shape? If your group is pulled away chasing fighters and the bombers you were guarding are suddenly exposed, what is your responsibility in that instant? Howard's citation describes a moment where he remained with the bombers and continued engaging enemy aircraft despite being separated from his own formation. That decision is the heart of leadership in aerial combat. It is choosing the mission over the comfort of numbers. It is understanding that the bombers below are locked to a route they cannot change. It is accepting that if you turn away, you may survive, but men behind you will not. And leadership also means endurance. Not one heroic pass, but repeated returns to the danger zone, each time with less fuel, less ammunition, and a growing sense that you are being measured by the enemy's persistence and by your own limits. Howard's leadership did not happen in a briefing room. It happened in that thin sky, where the only proof of resolve is what you do next. And what he did next would pull the story from background tension into the first hard collisions of the day. The P-51's most decisive feature wasn't a gun or a turn radius. It was time. time over the bombers, time deep inside Germany, time to climb, fight, disengage, and still be there when the next wave formed. With drop tanks and careful throttle discipline, the Mustang could escort at ranges that had previously left bomber crews exposed. And at altitude, it could do more than merely accompany. It could contest. But the aircraft's strength also created a new kind of pressure on its pilots. Long-range escort meant committing to hours in a cramped cockpit, managing fuel like a life support system, and fighting only when it mattered. A Mustang pilot could not treat every sighting as an opportunity. If he chased too far, he might not have the fuel to rejoin. If he climbed too hard, he might burn what he needed for the return trip across the sea. The technology demanded restraint, and then, at the critical moment, demanded violence. That contrast defined January 1944 escort combat. The P-51 gave the Americans a way to keep fighters where the Luftwaffe wanted them absent. But it didn't eliminate risk. It relocated it into the cockpit, into decisions made with a fuel gauge in the corner of the eye. When Howard's fight escalated, the Mustang was not a guarantee of survival. It was a tool that made an impossible job barely possible. And if the tool held, then the bombers below could keep flying in straight lines through the most dangerous air in Europe. By 1944, the Luftwaffe still had skilled pilots, and still had a powerful defensive system. But it was fighting with a shrinking margin. Every interception required coordination, radar detection, scramble timing, climb rate, and then the EDO decision of how to attack. Those decisions were influenced by what the German pilots saw. If escorts were thin or late, bomber formations became prey. If escorts were present, especially above and along the edges, attacks became costly. The Mustang complicated everything. A German pilot approaching a bomber formation had to choose between committing to the attack or reacting to the escort. And reaction is deadly in aerial combat. The moment a fighter stops thinking about its firing solution and starts thinking about survival, the attack loses precision. The pass becomes hurried. The burst is shorter. The angle is worse. The escape is steeper. That's how escorts saved bombers. Not always by shooting attackers down, but by corrupting the attack itself. On January 11th, when Howard remained near the bombers even after separation from his group, he presented the Luftwaffe with an uncomfortable problem. If they pressed the bombers, they had to accept that one Mustang would keep cutting into their passes. If they turned to deal with him, they bled time and opportunity while the bomber stream continued toward the target. In that sense, making them retreat rarely meant fear in the dramatic sense. It meant practicality. It meant the Luftwaffe discovering that the cost of each approach was rising until the attacks thinned, then broke off. Not because Germans lacked courage, but because the math was changing in midair. From inside a bomber, the fight looked different. The crew did not see a duel. They saw fragments, brief silhouettes, tracer lines, sudden impacts. They felt the aircraft shudder from flak concussions. They heard the intercom fill with clipped calls. Fighters at 12 o'clock. Fighters diving. Fighters pulling away. They watched the sky for parachutes and for aircraft on fire, because either one could belong to someone they knew. And they watched for escorts. A bomber crew could not choose to climb away from danger. They could not accelerate out of it. Their job required steadiness, hold formation, hold heading, keep the bombs for the target. That steadiness was also vulnerability. When an escort fighter stayed close, it gave them something rare in air war, the sensation that someone had agency on their behalf. One Mustang weaving near the formation could look like a small thing against a sky full of threats, but to a crew trapped in a predictable flight path, It meant the enemy might have to break off at the last second. It meant an attacker might miss. It meant the next few minutes might not be the last. So when Howard stayed with the bombers while enemy fighters continued to come, the moral weight of that choice extended downward through every aircraft in the stream. It wasn't just protection. It was solidarity at 25,000 feet. And when solidarity turns into contact, when the first pass comes in and the air fills with converging aircraft, the story stops being about preparation and becomes a fight measured in seconds. The bomber stream crossed into Germany like a moving city. Hundreds of aircraft, each one holding a rigid place in the sky. From a distance, the formation looked calm, almost orderly. But up close, it was a living machine under strain. Engines vibrating at constant power, propellers biting thin air, crews sealed inside cold aluminum, eyes fixed on instruments and the pale horizon ahead. The escort fighters rode above and along the edges, searching for the first sign of the enemy. On January 11th, the signs came early. Tiny specks appeared at altitude, climbing hard from below and angling in from the sun, an approach designed to hide speed and compress reaction time. At the same moment, flak began to mark the sky around the bombers. Bursts opened like black flowers and lingered, forcing the formation to fly through suspended violence. Then, German fighters committed. Some came in fast, single-engine silhouettes that flickered as they rolled and dove. Others were heavier shapes, twin-engine aircraft built to strike bombers with concentrated firepower before pulling away. The attack pattern was familiar to any crew who had been over Germany before. One wave to shake the gunners, another to exploit the distraction, then another to finish whatever had fallen out of line. For the escorts, there was no clean front. The sky had depth. Threats could come from above, below, and behind within seconds. Howard was where an escort leader had to be, close enough to protect, high enough to strike. When the first passes began to form, he did not chase blindly. He moved to intercept the attackers at the moment of commitment, when they were lined up and focused on the bombers, when their options narrowed. It was the escort pilot's most dangerous moment and most effective one. Attack the attacker while it is already locked into its run. In the confusion of converging aircraft, the fight broke into separate pieces, brief collisions of speed and fire that lasted seconds and ended with aircraft vanishing into glare or cloud. Howard's Mustang cut in toward a twin-engine threat that was pressing toward the bombers. He fired in controlled bursts because escort combat wasn't a matter of endless ammunition. It was a matter of measured violence. The enemy aircraft fell away, damaged, and then destroyed, dropping out of the fight. But the sky did not clear. More fighters came. They did not arrive politely, one at a time. They arrived as a problem that multiplied, new specks becoming new silhouettes, angles shifting, attacks stacking on top of each other. Bomber gunners tracked targets until they lost them. Escorts dove, climbed, reformed, and turned again, trying to stay between the bombers and the oncoming threat. In that churn, separation happened the way it always did. Not with a dramatic cut, but with a subtle failure of geometry. A pursuit line drifted. A turn widened. A few seconds of glare erased reference points. A pilot looked up, then back, and the friendly aircraft that had been near a moment ago were now somewhere else in the vastness. Howard realized he had lost contact with his group. This was the moment when the safe choice would have been to disengage and search for friendly formation. That is what training often demanded. Do not operate alone deep in enemy airspace. Do not become a solitary target. Do not waste fuel and ammunition when you might be needed later. But the bombers were still there. They were still flying straight, still absorbing flak, still drawing fighters the way light draws insects. They were locked to the mission path. They could not scatter. They could not reset. They could only keep going. Howard stayed with them, and staying with them meant accepting a new kind of fight, not one where you hunt with a wingman, but one where you become an obstacle again and again against repeated attacks. He turned back into the incoming fighters. Single-engine aircraft came in to make quick passes. Each time they dove toward the bombers, Howard forced them to account for him. Sometimes that meant a burst that made them brake early. Sometimes it meant closing fast enough that their attack angle collapsed. Sometimes it meant diving into their path so they had to choose between finishing their firing run or surviving the next seconds. The air around the bombers became a tightening arena. Howard was not fighting for a clean victory. He was fighting for interruptions, spoiling attacks, breaking timing, forcing enemy pilots to hesitate. Every disrupted pass was one less accurate burst into a cockpit, one less engine torn open, one less aircraft falling out of formation to be swarmed. But the Germans kept coming because they could see something too. They could see that he was alone. A single Mustang near a bomber formation is not just a target, it is a signal. It tells the attackers that the escort screen has thinned, that there might be a gap to exploit. It tempts them to press harder, to overwhelm what remains. So they did. They came again and again. Howard's Mustang snapped through turns at altitude, the aircraft's frame shuddering as it traded speed for position. He dove to meet one attacker and climbed back toward the bombers before the next wave could settle into firing range. He fired, pulled away, returned, and fired again, each pass consuming ammunition, each maneuver consuming fuel, each minute tightening the margin for survival. The bombers held their line through it all. They kept moving toward the target, toward the industrial heartland that was the whole reason they were here. The formation's purpose did not change simply because the sky above it had become a grinder. And above them, Howard began to feel the shape of the turning point, not yet in triumph, not yet in silence, but in the growing realization that the enemy was not just attacking the bombers, they were testing him. They were measuring how long one escort fighter could stand in the doorway. And as the next group of fighters angled in, faster and closer than before, the decision in the air became brutally simple. Either he would brake and leave the bombers exposed, or he would keep meeting the attack until something gave way. The next attacks came lower and faster. German fighters began to commit with urgency, angling in from different vectors, compressing the space around the bomber formation. They were no longer probing. They were pressing, trying to overwhelm the last visible layer of protection before fuel and distance carried the Americans beyond reach. Howard felt the change immediately. This was no longer a series of isolated engagements. It was sustained pressure. Each approach came closer to the bombers. Each breakaway came later. The Luftwaffe pilots had identified the reality of the situation. There was only one Mustang holding that side of the formation, and they intended to crush it. Howard dove to meet one fighter as it lined up for a firing run. He closed fast, firing in short, disciplined bursts. The German aircraft snapped away at the last second, its attack spoiled. Almost immediately, another followed, then another. There was no pause to climb and reset, no clean separation between engagements. The fight blurred into a continuous motion of turns, dives, and snap decisions. Ammunition began to run low. Fuel gauges crept downward. The cockpit narrowed into pure function. Instruments, canopy, sky. No time to think about how long he had been alone. No time to calculate odds. Only the immediate logic of aerial combat. Place the aircraft where it needs to be now, because 5 seconds from now may be too late. At one point, a fighter pressed in hard, refusing to brake. Howard stayed with him, matching the dive, closing until the enemy pilot finally veered away. His firing window collapsed, his pass ruined. The Mustang pulled back toward the bombers just as another threat formed above them. This pattern repeated again and again. The Luftwaffe pilots were skilled. They did not panic, but they were being denied clean solutions. Every time they committed, Howard was there, cutting across attack lines, forcing breaks, threatening pursuit. Even when he could not fire, his presence distorted their timing, and distortion was everything. Bomber defense was not built to stop perfect attacks. It was built to survive imperfect ones. If an enemy pilot fired too early, too late, or from a compromised angle, the bomber lived. If the attacker hesitated, even for a moment, the formation passed through danger intact. Gradually, almost imperceptibly at first, the rhythm changed. The attacks came less tightly coordinated. Fighters peeled away earlier. Some disengaged entirely, climbing back toward altitude but failing to reform quickly enough for another run. The sky around the bombers, once dense with converging threats, began to thin. Howard did not immediately recognize this as success. In combat, success rarely announces itself. It arrives quietly in the form of absence. Fewer silhouettes, more open sky, longer stretches without an incoming dive. When the next expected wave did not materialize, it became clear what had happened. The Luftwaffe attacks on that formation were breaking off, not because the Germans had been wiped out, not because they lacked courage or aircraft, but because the cost-benefit equation had shifted too far, too fast. Pressing attacks through a persistent escort, even a single one, was producing diminishing returns. The bombers were still intact. The escorts were still interfering. Fuel was burning. Time was slipping. So the enemy disengaged. The bomber formation continued on toward the target. Inside the aircraft, crews may not have known why the sky suddenly felt less crowded. They only knew that the pressure had eased, that the moment when everything could have collapsed had passed without collapse. Howard stayed with them until the danger truly receded. By the time friendly escort elements reappeared and coverage normalized, the most critical phase of the mission was already behind them. The bombers had survived the deepest penetration under sustained fighter attack. The Luftwaffe had been forced to spend effort and accept frustration instead of results. Only then did the magnitude of what had happened begin to settle in. Howard had not won a dramatic dogfight. He had not cleared the sky of enemy aircraft. He had done something far less visible and far more decisive. He had denied the enemy what they needed most: clean, repeated access to the bombers at the moment it mattered most. That denial rippled outward. Bombs fell on the target area as planned. Aircraft turned for home. Crews began the long, quiet process of counting who was still in formation and who was missing. And above them, the sky that had been a battlefield minutes earlier returned to something resembling emptiness. The fight was over. What remained was the accounting of damage, of survival, and of a single escort pilot whose decision to stay had altered the outcome of an entire segment of the mission. That accounting would not be finished in the air. It would wait on the ground, in debriefing rooms, reports, and citations, where the consequences of January 11th would finally be understood. When the bombers finally turned west, the sky did not feel victorious. It felt quiet. The return flight was always the longest part of the mission, not in miles, but in weight. Crews scanned the empty air with the same intensity they had during combat, because the mind did not immediately accept that the danger had passed. Engines were checked again and again. Gunners stayed alert, fingers stiff on triggers that had only recently cooled. Only slowly did the formation begin to take inventory. aircraft drifted into closer view. Damage became visible. Ragged flak holes in wings, blackened engine nacelles, shattered plexiglass patched with frost. Some bombers flew, slightly out of trim, fighting controls that would never feel normal again. Others were simply gone, leaving gaps where aircraft had once held position. Those gaps were counted. Inside the bombers that survived, crews tried to reconstruct what had happened above them. Many had seen only flashes. A Mustang slicing across their field of vision, enemy fighters breaking off at the last instant, tracer fire that stopped short of their cockpit. They knew they had been heavily attacked. They knew they had come through intact. They did not yet know why. Back in England, debriefing rooms filled with tired men smelling of oil, sweat, and cold metal. Intelligence officers collected reports. Gunners described angles and numbers. Pilots sketched engagements on chalkboards, trying to impose order on memory that had been compressed into seconds of stress. It was there that the pattern emerged. Multiple bomber crews independently described the same thing: sustained fighter pressure during the deepest phase of the mission, and the presence of a single escort fighter that repeatedly disrupted attacks when others were absent. The descriptions were consistent not because they were dramatic, but because they were practical. He stayed with us. He broke them up. They didn't get another clean run. Those phrases carried weight. When escort reports were matched to bomber accounts, James H. Howard's actions became clear in their full scope. He had engaged enemy fighters repeatedly while remaining close to the bombers, even after becoming separated from his own group. He had destroyed at least one enemy aircraft and damaged others. More importantly, he had continued fighting long past the point when Doctrine would normally have encouraged disengagement. This was not a single moment of heroism. It was sustained resistance. That distinction mattered deeply to the men who evaluated combat actions. Air war was not won by isolated flashes of brilliance. It was won by endurance under pressure, by pilots who stayed in the fight long enough to change its outcome. Howard's actions fit that definition precisely. When the recommendation for the Medal of Honor moved up the chain, it did so not because of inflated claims, but because the facts aligned across multiple perspectives. Escort pilots, bomber crews, and mission commanders all described the same reality. A bomber formation had been exposed at the most dangerous point of the mission and survived because one escort refused to leave. The citation would later record the essentials in formal language. But behind those words were hours of testimony, cross-checked against mission timelines, enemy claims, and aircraft losses. In an air war where exaggeration could be tempting, this case required none. The facts were enough. Yet the aftermath of January 11th extended beyond medals and paperwork. It fed directly into the evolving confidence of the 8th Air Force. Proof, in lived experience, that long-range escort was no longer theoretical. It worked. And if it worked once under that kind of pressure, it could work again. Which meant the consequences of that winter mission would not remain confined to a single formation or a single pilot. They would ripple outward into how the air war was fought next. In war, single actions only matter if the system around them can repeat the result. January 11, 1944 mattered because it wasn't an exception. It was a signal. The 8th Air Force had been searching for proof that the new escort reality could hold under maximum strain, deep inside Germany, in winter, under coordinated fighter attack. The mission showed that when the escort stayed with the bombers, the Luftwaffe's most effective pattern, repeated clean attacks on exposed formations, could be disrupted, not eliminated, not made harmless, but denied its easiest victories. That denial was strategic, because German air defense wasn't built on one decisive battle. It was built on repetition. It needed to intercept, damage, and destroy enough bombers often enough to make daylight bombing unsustainable. When escorts forced the Luftwaffe into messy, costly fights, when bomber losses dropped and fighter losses rose, the entire German defensive equation began to crack. And by early 1944, the pressure was building towards something larger. The Allies were preparing for an invasion of Western Europe. That invasion would require air superiority, not just local, not just temporary, but persistent. The Luftwaffe could not be allowed to contest the beaches and the supply lines. It had to be weakened before the first landing craft hit the water. So the air campaign intensified. Deep raids were no longer only about destroying targets. They were about drawing German fighters into combat again and again, forcing them to spend what they could not afford to spend: trained pilots, operational aircraft, and fuel. This is where long-range escort became more than protection. It became a trap. When German fighters rose to attack the bomber stream, they were no longer fighting bombers alone. They were fighting escorts that could follow them, force engagements, and stay long enough to press the fight. The escorts weren't just shields. They were hunters tied to a moving bait. That shift accelerated into the major operations that followed: raids aimed at Germany's aircraft industry, and the broader air campaign that culminated in the sustained offensives of early 1944. The point was not merely to break factories, but to break the Luftwaffe's ability to defend them. Howard's January 11th fight sat inside that larger story like a close-up shot in a wider film. A single pilot is never the whole war, but a single pilot can reveal what the war has become. By this stage, German fighter units faced a situation where success demanded perfect timing and coordination, while failure became easier and more frequent. If escorts were present in strength, German pilots had to break off earlier, accept worse angles, or risk being caught by fighters with equal or better performance at the altitudes where the fight happened. And every broken attack had a consequence. More bombers made it to targets. More bombs fell on factories, rail yards, and infrastructure. More German aircraft were forced into the air to respond. And the cycle repeated, grinding down the Luftwaffe's capacity in a way that was slow at first, then suddenly irreversible. For American crews, this didn't feel like an abstract strategy. It felt like survival rates inching upward. It felt like coming back with damage instead of not coming back at all. It felt like fewer empty chairs in briefing rooms. And it felt, increasingly, like the Germans were losing the freedom to choose when and where to fight. That loss of freedom is the beginning of defeat in an air war. Because once a defending air force is forced into constant reaction, scrambling repeatedly, engaging at disadvantage, bleeding experienced pilots, the decline becomes exponential. The pilots remaining are younger. The tactics become more desperate. The quality of interception falls even as the need for it rises. This is how the larger aftermath of January 11th should be understood. Not as a self-contained legend of a lone hero, but as a moment that demonstrated a new reality. Escort fighters could stay deep into Germany, protect bomber formations through sustained pressure, and force the Luftwaffe into fights it could not sustain forever. And with each mission that proved that reality, the next mission could go farther, hit harder, and demand even more from German defenses, which meant the war in the air was shifting toward its decisive phase, where the outcome would no longer hinge on whether the bombers could reach a target, but on whether Germany could still defend the sky at all. And once that question is asked often enough, it eventually becomes inevitable. The only thing left is to step back from the operational scale and face what January 11th reveals about warfare itself, about training, perception, and the thin line between being dismissed and being feared. In the retelling, people want a simple label. They want a genius, a natural, or the opposite, an untrained man who shocked the world. But war is rarely that clean. An air war is even less forgiving. At 25,000 feet, talent is only the starting point. What matters is training that holds under panic, discipline that survives fatigue, and judgment that remains sharp when the sky turns crowded and the fuel gauge sinks. January 11th, 1944 is remembered because it shows how history changes through small, measurable choices. A bomber formation cannot dodge what is coming. It must continue, straight, predictable, exposed, through the flak belts and into the interception lanes. The Luftwaffe, defending its own airspace, depends on rhythm and repetition. Assemble, attack, break away, climb, and strike again. That rhythm had worked until escorts learned to stay. And in one segment of that winter mission, when the escort screen thinned and the easy outcome seemed obvious, one Mustang remained visible beside the bombers and refused to become a footnote. Not through a single miraculous moment, but through repeated interruption, spoiling attack after attack until the cost became too high and the attackers finally disengaged. That is not myth. That is the real shape of air superiority as it is won. Not in speeches, not in slogans, but in persistence measured in minutes and miles. Because the turning point in war is often not the moment an enemy collapses. It is the moment the enemy hesitates, looks at the sky, looks at the odds, and decides the old method no longer works. And once that decision is made often enough, the future arrives quietly. Not with cheering, with empty air.